The cat had no business in the chapel, but then neither had the corpse. The creature, a sleek black animal of superior opinions and named with the village's habitual taste for the gently outrageous, Hecate, had installed herself upon the red velvet cushion of the stall nearest the altar and was asleep with the unctuous confidence of a bishop. She had washed her whiskers, tucked her paws beneath her like a tidy parcel, and closed her yellow eyes upon the insolent splendor of a beam of autumn sun that, escaping the reluctant clouds, found the lancet window and fell across the nave in a strip of powdered gold. The rest of the chapel lay damp and chill, smelling of old stone, overwaxed wood, and a medicinal odor of lilies that had outlasted last Sunday's vases. The corpse lay less comfortably upon the tiles before the altar rail, one hand extended, as if in supplication or exasperation, towards the carved oak of the gate. The head had struck the edge of the step with unfortunate finality, and one could not help but notice a smear of wax from a toppled candlestick had fallen upon the cheek like a sacramental tear. He had been a man of about 60, thick-bodied and florid. Even death had not dispelled the sense of him as a person accustomed to getting his own way by the application of weight rather than delicacy. His mouth, slightly open, displayed good teeth. His necktie was a white silk affair not quite suited to the hour. His eyes, one half veiled by the heavy lid, stared at the plaster saints with that impotent hostility which is the last unanswerable accusation. He was Sir Oswald Rattray of Graythorpe Hall, landowner, collector of ecclesiastical oddments, persecutor of tradesmen, and, until the previous evening, the terror and ornament of the parish of St. Friedzweide. The little chapelette, as the housekeeper pleased to call it, belonged to Sir Oswald, having been hauled stone by stone from the ruined chantry of St. Friedzweide's and rebuilt in a pious transport of mid-Victorian filial duty by some Rattray predecessor who had more money than theology. It clung like a limpet to the east wing of the hall, with a vestry poking out like a lopsided heir, and a bell-cote without a bell, the old one having cracked in '96 and never replaced. The parish church stood a proper half-mile away in the village, and the vicar, with that timidity which afflicts the clergy where baronets are concerned, had long since given up inquiring exactly under what spiritual auspices the hall's private devotions were conducted. Inspector Merriman of the county constabulary stood in the aisle, his hat in his hand, and his expression divided equally between a becoming gravity and a red-faced resentment at finding himself at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning being stared at by saints and cats. He turned when the tall, long-chinned man came in and said, with a sort of harassed relief, "Lord Peter, didn't expect you quite so early. We only sent up to Hereford Lodge an hour ago, begging your lordship's pardon if we've disturbed breakfast." Lord Peter Wimsey, who disliked being either begged or pardoned for such vulgarities as homicide, set his stick delicately against the wall and surveyed the chapel with an eye in which indolence and curiosity did a little minuet. He was spare and well-dressed, with that air peculiar to certain Englishmen of appearing to be entirely made of joints. His long hands had a fastidious way with them, as though existence were a matter of taste. He said, "You have not disturbed breakfast, you have merely postponed it, and if there is a difference, it is, like most theological distinctions, entirely practical. Is this the deceased? Ah, yes, a singularly inappropriate necktie for matins." "Matins," said Merriman, somewhat at sea. "My dear Merriman, it is an admirable thing in a policeman to be practical. It is an intolerable misfortune that it makes him incurious. Matins, the morning office, though the hour is hardly canonical, unless Sir Oswald kept time by the agricultural labourer's wrist. But don't let me interrupt your survey. What do the saints say?" "Saints don't say much," said the inspector with sour piety, "and cats say less. Dr. Claverings had a look, says he's been dead some hours. Blow on the head, see? Edge of the step there. No blood about, minimal as he puts it. There's been a fall, candlestick knocked over, wax on the cheek. You can see for yourself." The door to the vestry was on the latch, and the chapel door was ajar when Mrs. Bellwether, the housekeeper, found him at 7. Nobody heard anything in the night. "There's talk," added Merriman unwillingly, "that the bell tolled." "Bell." Merriman gestured fretfully at the bell-cote, visible faintly through the clear glass of the west window like a pair of small horns. "No bell. Cracked years back. But Lomas, the gardener, says he heard one stroke a little after 12. He was walking home from the Nag's Head, and only the one. Says it was the chapel bell, though there isn't any. You know how the villagers are." Lord Peter stooped and peered at the toppled candlestick. It was an ecclesiastical brass thing with a ludicrously fat knop and a pricket that would have impaled the conscience of a bishop. A gobbet of wax had run from the half-burned candle and puckered itself upon the flagstones into a yellow tear. He held his head to one side, like a bird, and sniffed delicately. Paraffin." From the vestry lamp, St. Fridswide would be scandalized. She preferred beeswax. He straightened, and, noticing the Bible open upon the lectern, moved to it and glanced down. Then he smiled. "Amusing. Romans 6, if I do not mistake the ragged look of the page. The wages of sin is death, as our moralists love to tell us, with the plural wrong as usual. What is the use of dying for grammar if posterity will be careless?" "It's no use dying at all, to my mind," said Merriman, who could not be got to be humorous before coffee. "And Rattray's done it awkwardly. If it's accident, why's the vestry lamp nearly dry but the candle half burned? Why has he got his glove on the right hand, and not the left? Why was the window unlatched? That's more Mrs. Bellwether's department. She says she latched it last evening when she did for the altar flowers. And then there's the cat." He glanced with manifest suspicion at Hecate, who shifted her fat haunches minimally and did not open her eyes. "The cat," said Lord Peter, "is the only person in the room who has behaved with a proper sense of decorum. May I?" He moved to the window in the south wall. It was a slender, arched slit with a coloured bit of saint. Frieds-wide looking, as all early English saints look, both saccharine and dangerous. The latch, of simple iron, was raised. A pale draught felt its way along the sill and pulled the dust motes about in a slow ballet. "Mrs. Bellwether latched it last night," repeated Merriman. "Says she always does. The place is damp anyway." Lord Peter nodded. "And damp is the death of everything except ghosts. Where is Mrs. Bellwether, and who found Sir Oswald?" "She," said the inspector, consulting his notebook. "At 7 of the clock, she says. She comes to lay the fire in Sir Oswald's study and then to dust the chapel if it's looking frosty. She noticed the door was ajar and the draught, and she saw his lordship, beg pardon, Sir Oswald, on the tiles. Screamed. Lomas heard and came up from the yard. Miss Verity Lark, that's the companion, was walking in the east garden and came running in. Mr. Hugh Rattray came down then, the nephew. Lady Honoria Rattray arrived after, with Mr. Pritchard the butler. Pritchard is grotesque, murmured Lord Peter, as if repeating the weather forecast. Grotesque, said Merriman, bristling slightly with the professional jealousy of a man who had seen Pritchard's side whiskers and not thought them evidence. In the old, proper sense, said Lord Peter, a gargoyle of a man. He is faithful to the wine cellar, and the wine cellar rewards him with a pasty countenance. Do go on. There's the village vicar, Mr. Arkwright, who is as white as his surplice and about as much use. Came up when the house sent for him and said prayers over the body, which I dare say comforted the ladies, but didn't do much to answer questions. Dr. Clavering pronounces him dead since after midnight and before dawn. He isn't confident of more without an examination. Says the blow to the head would have done, even without any heart trouble. Lord Peter looked at the cushion beneath Hecate, upon which there was a faint pattern of cat's hair and dust drawn by recent occupancy. He extended a finger, and Hecate, like a duchess acknowledging a footman, condescended to flick the tip with one idle whisker. Upon the velvet near the cat's paw, barely visible, was a tiny grain of something that caught the light. He took from his pocket a monocle attached to a black ribbon. This was not entirely an affectation, but it is always agreeable to convey to the world that one is prepared to be amused by it. The little grain glinted. He suppressed a smile. "Do you know," he said, as if reciting a trivial anecdote, "that cats always choose a warm place? The cushion beneath Hecate is warmer than the neighboring stall, though both have been in the sun for the same period. It suggests a recent occupant with a higher temperature than a stone saint and more guilt than a mouse. How cozy for her!" "Yes, yes, Hecate, we commend your practical theology. Inspector, did anyone notice the vestry rug?" "The what?" said Merriman. "The rug in the vestry, coloured, from Morocco, with a pattern like a headache. When I came in, the corner nearest the door was turned over. That is not in Mrs. Bellwether's habits. She is a woman who treads corners down." Merriman, who had noticed in the course of a lifetime innumerable corners and had never before found them significant, made a noise that suggested regret that certain aristocrats had been permitted to survive the Commonwealth. "We can go look," he said, with an air like a hangman accepting a bribe to wear gloves. "Presently," said Lord Peter. "Tell me first, where were the family?" "The house party? It is a house party, I suppose. There is the faint smell of new luggage about the stairs, and a scent, not lilies. That is not English." Merriman consulted his notes with the air of a man called to recite unfamiliar poetry before unsympathetic dons. Sir Oswald dined at 8 with Lady Honoria, Mr. Hugh Rattray, Miss Verity Lark, companion to Lady Honoria. Mr. Julian Carse was present. He's a suitor to Miss Lark, according to Mrs. Bellwether. There was also Mr. Nathaniel Colby, organist at the parish church. He and Sir Oswald were thick lately. Something about the Rattenbury organ. After dinner there was music in the drawing-room, then bridge until 10:30. Mr. Colby left at 11. Mr. Carse says he went to bed at 10:30. Lady Honoria went up at 10:45 with Miss Lark. Mr. Hugh was in the library until 12. He admits to whiskey. Pritchard was in the pantry until midnight. Mrs. Bellwether says she went up before 11. The gardener Lomas was at the Nag's Head till closing, which is 11. The vicar was at home. And Sir Oswald left the drawing-room at 11:15. Pritchard says he saw him take the key to the chapel from the bracket in the hall. Says Sir Oswald did so frequently of an evening to take the air with Saint. Fred's wide, as he called it. The chapel door was ajar when found, however, observed Lord Peter mildly. And the key? In his pocket. Lord Peter looked again at the dead man's hand, extended upon the floor as if petitioning. There was a glove upon the right hand, a good glove, newish, brown with a tiny, disagreeable notch in the stitching. No glove upon the left. The left cuff was faintly stained, as if from handling something that did not quite wish to be handled. "Hecate is fortunate," he said, as if to her. "She has neither left nor right glove, neither pockets nor any difficulty in extracting a fish head from a pail. She therefore does not mislay keys. Who wound the clock?" "There isn't one," said Merriman on his guard. "Oh, there is," said Lord Peter, eyes travelling to the small bracket timepiece in the vestry, visible through the half-open door. "A French affair, as incongruous as a fawn in a chancel. It stopped at 12:07, which appears to be the fashionable hour for things to stop. You see, Inspector, how the universe conspires to flatter our illusions." He added, "The bell that tolled at a little after 12, it tolled once, did it not? Mrs. Bellwether will assure you it is nonsense, and Mr. Lomas will swear on his grandmother's grave that it is gospel. The truth, like most Christian doctrine, will be somewhere between. We must ask the rope." "The rope?" "The bell rope. There is no bell, but there is often a rope. The English love to keep the instrument when they have disposed of the purpose." Lord Peter's gaze drifted to a coil of bell rope neatly hung by the vestry door. Neatly, and yet with the tail end reversed under, as if someone unfamiliar with Mrs. Bellwether's fetish for order had replaced it in a hurry. He picked up his stick, then recollected himself, and looked back at Sir Oswald with that impersonal courtesy with which we acknowledge the presence of a social superior who has, for the moment, no power to injure us. "Do not think me heartless," he said, perhaps to Merriman, perhaps to himself. "I am merely practical, and it is, like most distinctions, a matter of breakfast. If you will kindly prevent anyone from tidying for the sake of piety, I will return in 20 minutes with a cup of coffee and a more amenable nature." Merriman nodded, his expression souring again to its habitual fermented patience. "And your first impression, my lord?" he asked, unable to help himself. Lord Peter smiled an amiable, feline smile toward Hecate, who yawned delicately and turned her back upon both men. "My first impression is that saint. Friderswide is bored," he said. "When saints grow bored, men behave badly. As for the mechanics, well, we shall not begin with bells and candles. We shall begin, if you please, with carpets, and why Mrs. Bellwether would sooner go to perdition than turn back a corner." He lifted his hat to the cat, who did not move, and stepped out into the chill corridor, where the air smelled of damp linen and old polish and something else. Some faint, wild scent, like bruised rosemary, that did not belong to a house at all. He did, in fact, return in precisely 21 minutes, accompanied not by cherubim and seraphim, but by a plain white cup and a disposition to entertain the universe's more pressing mysteries. The bomb coffee was excellent, a small triumph of civilization over chaos that suggested either Mrs. Bellwether possessed hidden depths or Sir Oswald had been a man who understood that murder, like breakfast, required proper preparation. Merriman had resisted the human impulse to tidy, and the chapel lay exactly as death had arranged it. The wax tear still pouted at the stone, Hecate maintained her episcopal repose, and the draught at the south window continued its indecent flirtation with the page of Romans. The air had grown colder, carrying with it that faint, wild scent, not quite rosemary, not quite English, that seemed to drift through the corridors like an uninvited guest. "Now then," said Lord Peter, setting his cup upon the vestry shelf with the reverence due to good china, "let us commit domestic sacrilege and examine Mrs. Bellwether's domain more closely." The vestry, cramped as a confessional and twice as revealing, held its secrets in the manner of all small spaces, obviously and yet invisibly. The Morocco rug lay between the door and an oak chest, its corner turned back with the precision of a woman folding bed linen. Lord Peter knelt and studied the exposed flagstone beneath, where a thin film of dust had been disturbed by recent passage. "You see, Inspector," he murmured, lifting the corner further, "this is not habit, but intention. Mrs. Bellwether would no more leave a rug rucked than she would serve tea in a chamber pot." He paused, extracting something minute from the fringe, a dark fleck no larger than a grain of pepper, which glinted faintly in the lamplight. "And what have we here?" "Something that has travelled from elsewhere to lodge in Mrs. Bellwether's perfect housekeeping." He deposited the fragment carefully in his waistcoat pocket and straightened, his gaze moving to the small French clock on its bracket. 7 minutes past 12, frozen in time like a guilty conscience. "The paraffin lamp," he observed, "is nearly dry, yet the candle upon the altar was only half burned when it fell. Curious mathematics, that. And the bell rope." His eyes found the coiled hemp hanging by the door, neatly arranged, yet somehow wrong, like a sentence with a misplaced comma. Someone has handled it who was not familiar with Mrs. Bellwether's particular theology of order. Mrs. Bellwether's testament. Mrs. Bellwether, summoned from her kingdom below stairs, appeared with the majesty of a woman who had spent 40 years ensuring that the universe remained properly starched. She was formidable in the way that only English housekeepers can be. A force of nature disguised as a servant, with small, sharp eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. "Your lordship," she said, settling her considerable bulk upon a chair with the authority of a judge taking the bench. "I hope you'll not think me presumptuous, but I've taken the liberty of keeping luncheon warm. The family are not themselves, naturally, but life must go on, and empty stomachs serve no one. You are wisdom itself, Mrs. Bellwether," said Lord Peter gravely. "Now, about last evening. You attended to the chapel at what hour?" 6 o'clock precisely, my lord, as is my custom. I arranged fresh lilies on the altar, white ones, as Sir Oswald preferred, though they do give one such a headache with their scent. I lit the beeswax candle in the great brass candlestick, filled the paraffin lamp in the vestry, latched the south window against the damp, and arranged the rug just so. Her voice carried the satisfaction of duty properly performed. Lord Peter's eyebrows performed a small, interested dance. "Beeswax, you say?" "Indeed, my lord." Sir Oswald was most particular. Said paraffin was common, fit only for servants' quarters. The chapel was to have beeswax always, from the hives at Thornfield Farm. I remember distinctly, because our supply was running low and I made a note to order more. "And yet," said Whimsy gently, "the wax upon Sir Oswald's cheek, and indeed upon the flagstones, is unmistakably paraffin. A small detail, perhaps, but one that suggests someone replaced your careful arrangements with something rather more expedient." Mrs. Bellwether's face underwent a transformation that would have impressed Medusa. "Replaced my candle with paraffin. The very idea. I put a beeswax candle there, my lord, as sure as I'm sitting here. If there's paraffin wax in that chapel, it didn't come from my doing." "Quite so. And the window, you latched it securely." "As I have done every evening for 20 years, my lord. The damp is terrible in that chapel, and Sir Oswald complained bitterly if the altar cloths grew musty. I latched it with my own hand and tested it twice." "The bell rope?" Mrs. Bellwether's gaze moved to the vestry door, and her mouth tightened. "Coiled properly, as always. I don't hold with slovenly habits, not even with things that serve no purpose. Though why Sir Oswald's father insisted on keeping a rope for a bell that doesn't exist, I'm sure I don't know." "Perhaps," suggested Lord Peter, "he understood that some things are more useful broken than whole. Now, Mrs. Bellwether, a delicate matter. You mentioned that the maid, Eliza, was to dust the stalls after dinner." "She was, my lord, though the poor child has ears like sieves and often forgets her duties. She may have left the door ajar when she finished. She's not one for attention to details. And the scent I noticed in the corridors, herbal, rather like rosemary, but not quite. Would you know its source?" Mrs. Bellwether's hands, which had been folded with military precision, began a small, unconscious ringing motion. "Miss Lark is fond of the East Garden, my lord. She cuts herbs there, rosemary and such. She makes tisanes for Lady Honoria's headaches. The scent does cling to her clothes, and she walks the corridors at odd hours sometimes when she cannot sleep." "Miss Lark suffers from insomnia?" "Poor child has much to trouble her sleep, my lord. She's dependent on Lady Honoria's charity, and Mr. Carsey's attentions are, well, perhaps not as disinterested as a young lady might hope. And Sir Oswald—" She paused, loyalty warring with honesty. Sir Oswald could be kind, but he was also a man who liked to have his own way in all things. There was talk lately of changes to his will, and Miss Lark feared for her position. The grotesque speaks. Pritchard, the butler, arrived with the measured tread of a man who had learned to walk carefully around other people's secrets. He was indeed grotesque in the classical sense. A gargoyle of a man, with side whiskers that defied both fashion and gravity, and small eyes that darted about like trapped beetles. His hands, Lord Peter noticed, bore a faint tremor that suggested either advanced age or advanced anxiety. "A most lamentable occurrence, my lord," Pritchard intoned, his voice carrying the oily deference of a man who had spent his life opening doors for people who never thanked him. Sir Oswald was a character, to be sure. The hall will seem quite empty without his presence. Indeed. You saw him take the chapel key at 11:15? Precisely so, my lord. He bade me good night and said he intended to take the air with Saint Fritz Wyde, a phrase he employed when he wished to spend time in private contemplation. He often did so after dinner, particularly when he had correspondence to consider or difficulties to resolve. Difficulties? Pritchard's Adam's apple performed a small, nervous dance. Sir Oswald had been somewhat exercised by various matters lately, my lord. The organ fund at St. Frid Wyde's, Mr. Hugh's financial expectations, certain questions regarding Miss Lark's future arrangements. He was not a man to leave problems unresolved. And the key was in its usual place on the bracket. Indeed, my lord. I saw him take it myself. The chapel is always locked when not in use. Sir Oswald's particular instruction. He valued his privacy for devotions. Lord Peter studied the butler's face with the attention of a lepidopterist examining a particularly interesting specimen. The bell rope in the vestry. Pritchard? When did you last observe it? The tremor in Pritchard's hands increased perceptibly. The bell rope, my lord. That is to say, it hangs in the vestry, as it always has. Though, of course, there has been no bell to ring these 30 years, not since the old one cracked and was never replaced. And yet Mr. Lomas, the gardener, claims to have heard a single stroke at a little after midnight. Imagination, perhaps, or the effects of the Nag's Head's excellent ale. Mr. Lomas is a man of fanciful notions, my lord, Pritchard said, his voice growing thin, and the ale at the Nag's Head is indeed potent. No bell has rung from that chapel in my time, I can assure you of that. The French clock in the vestry, Lord Peter continued, conversationally, has stopped at 12:07. Do you recall its condition when you last saw it? Pritchard's face had grown pale as old parchment. The clock, my lord? I rarely pay attention to that particular timepiece. It's a foreign thing, quite out of place in a proper English chapel. Sir Oswald bought it at some auction. He had a passion for collecting oddities. I believe it was running when I last noticed, but I cannot be certain of the precise time. No matter, said Lord Peter pleasantly. Clocks, like witnesses, sometimes stop at the most inconvenient moments. Thank you, Pritchard. You have been most illuminating. The household revealed. As Pritchard departed with the haste of a man escaping judgment, Lord Peter turned to Merriman with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. You see, Inspector, how the domestic fabric unravels when pulled by the proper thread. Mrs. Bellwether's beeswax candle becomes paraffin. Her securely latched window stands ajar. Her properly coiled rope shows signs of amateur handling, and our faithful Pritchard develops a most convenient vagueness when asked about bells and clocks. He moved to the vestry window and peered out at the east garden, where a figure in a dark coat could be seen walking among the herb beds with the determined pace of someone trying to outrun their thoughts. Miss Lark, he observed, communing with her rosemary. How touching. And Mr. Carse, no doubt, somewhere nearby, composing verses about the tragic beauty of orphaned virtue. Young men are so predictable in their romanticism. You think one of them did it? Merriman asked, his notebook poised like a weapon. I think, my dear Inspector, that we are dealing with a household where everyone has secrets, and someone has been clever enough to use those secrets as camouflage for murder. The question is not who had motive. They all did, in their various ways. The question is who had the wit to arrange such an elaborate charade, and why they chose to make it look like an accident when a simple fall would have served just as well. He paused, watching as Hecate emerged from the chapel and picked her way across the lawn with the dignity of a dowager empress inspecting her domain. "Even the cat knows something is amiss," he murmured. "Cats, unlike humans, have no talent for self-deception. They see things as they are, not as they ought to be. Which is why Hecate chose to sleep in the warmest spot in the chapel, the spot recently vacated by someone who was very much alive and very much afraid." The scent of rosemary drifted through the open window, stronger now, mixed with something else. The metallic tang of approaching rain, and underneath it all, the faint but unmistakable odor of secrets beginning to rot in the autumn air. "Come, Inspector," said Lord Peter, collecting his stick and moving toward the door. "Let us go and have a word with Miss Lark about her nocturnal wanderings. I have a feeling that her insomnia may prove to be the most revealing symptom of all." They found Miss Verity Lark precisely where the morning light had promised, moving among the geometric precision of the East Garden with the restless energy of someone attempting to outpace her own thoughts. She was a creature of that particular English beauty which appears fragile until examined closely, whereupon one discovers it to be constructed of excellent bones, clear resolve, and a will that had learned to bend rather than break. Her dark dress, well made but not recent, suggested genteel poverty worn with dignity, and her hands bore the telltale green stains that come from handling fresh herbs in the early hours. "Miss Lark," said Lord Peter, approaching with the courteous air of a man requesting permission to examine a rare botanical specimen, "we find you communing with your garden. How very wise. Plants, unlike people, rarely lie about their intentions." She straightened, a pair of silver shears glinting in her hand, and regarded them with grey eyes that held the watchful quality of someone who had learned to count the footfalls of danger long before they reached the threshold. "Lord Peter," she said, inclining her head with careful politeness. "Inspector Merriman, I suppose you have questions about last night's tragedy." "Indeed we do," said Whimsy pleasantly, noting how her fingers tightened involuntarily upon the shears. "Though I confess myself equally curious about your nocturnal horticultural habits. Mrs. Bellwether mentioned that you suffer from insomnia and are given to midnight perambulations. A trying affliction, sleep, like virtue, becomes more elusive the more earnestly one pursues it." A faint flush touched her pale cheeks. "I do find it difficult to rest, my lord. The house grows oppressive at night. The corridors hold too many shadows, and the scent of lilies from the chapel becomes quite overwhelming. I often walk in the garden when sleep eludes me." "And last evening," Merriman interjected, his notebook poised with the patience of a grave-digger, "I retired with Lady Honoria at 11:15, as is our custom. I read to her for a short while. She suffers from nervous headaches and left her near midnight. But I found myself quite unable to settle. The air seemed particularly close, so I came down to the garden for a breath of something less ecclesiastical." Lord Peter bent and pinched a sprig of the herb she had been cutting, holding it to his nose with the concentration of a wine taster. The crushed leaves released their familiar, sober scent, but underneath lay something else. Something sharper, more resinous, that spoke of warmer climates and older traditions. "Rosemary," he observed, but not entirely of the English persuasion. "There's something Mediterranean about this particular variety. Stronger, more aromatic than our native herb. One might almost imagine it growing wild in monastery gardens, where the monks understood its uses beyond mere cookery." Miss Lark's composure wavered like a candle in a draught. Lady Honoria prefers the stronger variety for her tisanes. It was planted by Sir Oswald's grandmother, who had eclectic tastes in gardening." "Ah, the grandmother. How convenient that the dead cannot contradict our botanical attributions." Whimsy's tone remained pleasantly conversational, but his eyes had grown sharp as winter starlight. "And during your midnight constitutional, Miss Lark, did you perhaps notice anything unusual about the chapel? A light under the door, perhaps? A sound that might have been mistaken for a bell?" Her hands began to tremble slightly, and she set down the shears with careful precision. I may have seen a faint glow from that direction. Sir Oswald often took his devotions at odd hours, and I thought I heard... But it's impossible. There is no bell. No bell, certainly. But perhaps the memory of one. Sound, like guilt, has a way of echoing long after its source has been silenced. Lord Peter paused, studying her face with the gentle attention of a confessor. You are fond of Sir Oswald, I suppose? The question struck home with unexpected force. Miss Lark's carefully maintained composure cracked entirely, and in her eyes blazed a mixture of fear, resentment, and something that might have been relief. Fond, the word emerged as a bitter laugh. Sir Oswald was many things, my lord, but fond is not among them. He treated me as a possession, not a person. He threatened to cast me out, to ensure I had nothing if I did not cease my friendship with Mr. Carse. Ah, said Whimsy softly, the heart of the matter reveals itself. Mr. Carse, would that be the young gentleman with the artistic scarf and the poetic temperament? I believe I glimpsed him lurking behind the yew hedge, no doubt composing verses about the tragic beauty of love thwarted by tyranny. As if summoned by his name, Julian Carse emerged from the shadows of the garden path, his fair hair dishevelled and his artistic scarf arranged with the careful carelessness of youth. He approached with the easy insolence of one who had never been caught doing a kindness, his eyes fixed protectively upon Miss Lark. Verity, he said, ignoring the two men entirely. You must not allow yourself to be badgered by these gentlemen. You look pale. This is infamous, Inspector. The poor girl has suffered enough. The poor girl, said Lord Peter with dangerous mildness, appears perfectly capable of defending herself, which she will do in excellent English if it becomes necessary. Mr. Carse, I presume? Poet, novelist, or merely a young man with an unfortunate relationship with haberdashery? Carse flushed an unbecoming shade of red. I'm a writer, which I suppose makes me suspect in your world. Are you the famous Lord Peter? The family mentioned you were clever. Cleverness, I find, often masks vulgarity. How charmingly put, Whimsy replied. I shall endeavour to be both vulgar and effective. You retired early last evening, I understand. Feeling unwell? I had a headache. I went to my room before the bridge game concluded. Bridge is a barbarous amusement for barbarous minds. Indeed. And did you remain in your room throughout the night? Certainly. I wrote for a while, then slept. Lord Peter examined his fingernails with elaborate care. How curious. You see, Mr. Carse, there is a faint dusting of soot beneath your nails. Not charcoal, which an artist might explain, but lamp-black. The sort that comes from trimming wicks or handling poorly maintained paraffin lamps. Rather odd for a young gentleman who claims to have spent the evening composing verses by electric light. The colour drained from Carse's face as completely as water from a broken pitcher. He glanced involuntarily at Miss Lark, and in that glance Lord Peter read volumes. I lit a candle in my room, Carse stammered. The electricity is unreliable in the servants' wing. The servants' wing? Merriman's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. I was given to understand you were housed in the guest quarters. That is... Carse's voice trailed off as he realized the trap he had laid for himself. Quite so, said Whimsy pleasantly. The servants' quarters, where paraffin lamps are commonplace, and young gentlemen might find themselves handling unfamiliar equipment in the dark. Tell me, Mr. Carse, what brought you to the East Corridor at midnight? Romance, I suppose. The eternal folly of youth imagining itself the first to discover love. Miss Lark stepped forward, her chin raised with sudden defiance. Yes, she said clearly. Julian came to see me. We met in the garden. Sir Oswald had forbidden our friendship, threatened to dismiss me if I continued to see him. We hoped that if we were discreet, and discretion led you both to the vicinity of the chapel at the very hour when Sir Oswald met his unfortunate end," Wimsey observed. "How remarkably convenient for someone with murder in mind." "We didn't murder anyone," Cars burst out. "We were nowhere near the chapel." We walked in the garden, spoke of our future, and then I returned to my room. Verity went back to the house shortly after midnight. "After midnight," Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. "And yet, Miss Lark, you told us you retired before midnight. Small discrepancies, but they do accumulate like interest on a debt. Inspector, I believe we have sufficient material for further consideration. Miss Lark, Mr. Cars, I trust you will remain available for additional questions. Murder, like bad poetry, rarely reveals all its secrets at first reading." As they walked back toward the house, Merriman muttered, "Clear motive, opportunity, and now we've caught them in lies about their whereabouts. What more do we need?" "Patience, my dear Inspector," Wimsey replied, pausing to examine a fallen rose petal with the attention of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. "We have motive aplenty." Miss Lark threatened with dismissal. Young Cars thwarted in love, both caught in the vicinity at the crucial hour. But murder is rarely so obliging as to present itself in such neat packages. There is still the matter of the bell that rang without existing, the candle that changed its nature, and the curious case of Hecate's warm cushion. Until we understand why someone went to such elaborate lengths to disguise a simple crime, we cannot be certain we understand the crime at all. He straightened, his gaze moving to the chapel windows where the autumn light caught the colored glass and threw patterns of red and gold across the stone. "Besides," he added with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever, "I've always found it suspicious when suspects confess so readily to the obvious crime. It suggests they may be hiding something rather more interesting than mere murder." The scent of rosemary lingered in the air, stronger now, mixed with the approaching promise of rain and something else, something that spoke of secrets cultivated in darkness and harvested in blood. The transition from garden to house brought them through corridors that seemed to exhale the accumulated secrets of generations, each portrait and tapestry a silent witness to the Rattray family's long acquaintance with both respectability and scandal. Lord Peter paused at the great hall's center, his gaze traveling from the medieval stonework to the more recent Victorian additions with the discriminating eye of a connoisseur, assessing the layers of familial neurosis. "Inspector," he observed, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused detachment he reserved for the more baroque manifestations of human nature, "have you ever noticed how the very rich possess an almost supernatural talent for making their houses both magnificent and profoundly uncomfortable? One feels perpetually that one is trespassing even when specifically invited to investigate a murder." They found Lomas, the gardener, in the potting shed, his weathered hands coaxing life from a reluctant geranium cutting. He was a man whose face had been carved by decades of English weather into a map of rural stoicism, possessed of that particular honesty that comes from a lifetime spent in the company of plants, which never lie about their intentions. "Bell, my lord," Lomas repeated, setting down his work with the careful attention of a man who had learned that gentlemen's questions, however oddly phrased, generally led somewhere important. "Aye, I heard it right enough. Clear as Sunday morning, though I'll grant you it gave me a proper turn. Just the one stroke, mind. Not like calling to service, more like, well, like a passing bell, if you take my meaning." "Indeed I do," said Wimsey pleasantly. "And the time? 12:15, near as makes no difference. The Nag's Head closes at 11 sharp. Old Pennyworth particular about that, what with the constable's rounds. We stood talking a bit after, about the harvest and such. I reckon it was just gone midnight when I set off home, and I'd walked maybe 10 minutes when I heard it. One stroke, clear and true, from the chapel direction." "You're certain it was the chapel bell?" Lomas's weathered features creased into a frown of concentration. "Well now, my lord, that's the queer thing. I know that bell's been cracked these 30 years. Heard it crack myself, I did, during the great storm of '96. But the sound came from that direction, and it had that particular tone, if you understand me. Deep and sort of sorrowful-like. Made the hair stand up on my arms, it did. And you saw no one? No light in the chapel? There was a glow in the windows, like candlelight. But that weren't unusual. Sir Oswald often took his prayers late. What struck me odd was the smell. Lord Peter's attention sharpened perceptibly. Smell? Churchy smell, my lord. Not the usual mustiness, but something foreign-like. Sweet and sharp at the same time. Put me in mind of the old days when my grandmother used to tell stories about the monks at St. Frideswide's. She said they burned special incense that could call the dead back to hear their prayers. The drawing-room revelations. Lady Honoria Rattray received them in the morning room with the fragile dignity of a woman who had learned to wield invalidism like a perfectly balanced sword. She was arranged upon a chaise longue with the precision of a museum exhibit, her silver hair dressed with military exactitude, her pale hands never quite still as they fluttered between a vinaigrette and a handkerchief soaked in lavender water. "Lord Peter," she murmured, extending one translucent hand as if bestowing a papal blessing. "How kind of you to come, though I fear the shock has quite undone me. Poor Oswald, to die alone in that dreadful chapel, with only the saints for company." "Not entirely alone," Wimsey observed, settling himself where he could observe both her face and the garden beyond the windows. Hecate was present, and cats make notoriously unreliable witnesses. They see everything and tell nothing. A visible shudder passed through Lady Honoria's delicate frame. "That creature has always given me the most uncomfortable sensations. She appears wherever there is trouble, like some dreadful familiar. Oswald encouraged her presence in the chapel, said she kept the mice away, but I always felt there was something unnatural about her devotions. About last evening, Lady Honoria. You retired early, I understand?" Her hands performed their familiar dance with the handkerchief. "At 11:15, yes. The bridge had given me such a headache. All that concentration quite exhausts one. Dear Verity was so kind, she read to me from Tennyson until I felt able to rest. Such a comfort, that girl. I don't know what I should do without her." And yet Sir Oswald threatened to dismiss her. The pale eyes hardened momentarily, revealing steel beneath porcelain. Oswald could be unreasonable about certain matters. He disapproved of Mr. Carse's attentions to Verity, thought him unsuitable. A writer, you know, no prospects, no family to speak of. Oswald believed in practical arrangements. What manner of practical arrangements? Lady Honoria's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. He had formed certain ideas. There was talk of a position with his sister in Scotland. A remote situation, quite cut off from society, or perhaps marriage to Mr. Colby, the organist, a respectable man, though rather old for dear Verity. Mr. Colby, the gentleman who dined here last evening? The one with the passionate interest in ecclesiastical music? Yes, though I confess I find his enthusiasm rather intense. He speaks of nothing but stops and pipes and the spiritual significance of proper tuning. Oswald found him amusing, said he was the only man in the county who understood the true purpose of sacred music. They had been collaborating lately on some research into the original saint, Frideswide's, something about bells and ancient rituals. Through the window, Lord Peter observed a figure approaching across the lawn with the aggressive purposefulness of a man who had spent the morning seeking courage in a bottle. Hugh Rattray was a younger, softer version of his uncle, possessed of the same thick build, but lacking the iron will that had made Sir Oswald formidable. "The nephew approaches," Wimsey observed. "Sir Oswald's heir, I believe." His only heir, Lady Honoria confirmed with a sigh that held more resignation than grief. Poor Hugh has never quite lived up to his uncle's expectations. Oswald despaired of him, said he had no backbone, no proper understanding of duty. There had been difficulties lately about Hugh's debts. Hugh Rattray entered with the subtlety of a cannonball, bringing with him the unmistakable aroma of whiskey and desperation. His eyes were bloodshot, his necktie askew, and his hands trembled with more than grief. "Mr. Rattray," said Inspector Merriman with professional patience, "we were hoping to clarify your movements last evening. You mentioned being in the library until midnight." Hugh's gaze darted nervously between the faces watching him. "Yes, the library." "Reading. Couldn't sleep, you know. Uncle Oswald had suggested I educate myself about the family properties, ecclesiastical architecture and such." "Ecclesiastical architecture," Whimsy repeated with interest. "How remarkably coincidental. And this reading matter, did it perhaps touch upon the subject of bells, sacred acoustics, the proper conduct of midnight devotions?" The question struck Hugh like a physical blow. He swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. Why would you ask that? What has architecture to do with Uncle Oswald's accident?" "Everything," said Whimsy softly, "if the architecture in question includes the means to create the illusion of supernatural intervention where none exists. The physical evidence speaks." Returning to the chapel, Lord Peter moved with the focused attention of a scholar examining a particularly complex manuscript. The paraffin wax still gleamed accusingly upon the flagstones, and the French clock maintained its frozen testimony at 7 minutes past 12. "Observe, Inspector," he said, kneeling beside the toppled candlestick. "The wax is unmistakably paraffin, yet Mrs. Bellwether swears she placed a beeswax candle here. Someone substituted it, but why? Paraffin burns differently, smells differently, leaves different residue. It suggests someone wished to create evidence of Sir Oswald using the vestry lamp for illumination." He moved to the bell rope, examining it with the concentration of a wine taster. And this rope, coiled with precision, yet showing signs of recent handling by someone unfamiliar with Mrs. Bellwether's particular theology of order. "Someone pulled this rope, Inspector, not to ring a non-existent bell, but to create the sound of one." "But how?" Merriman demanded. "There's no bell." "No bell, certainly. But there would have been a clapper housing, perhaps even fragments of the old bell mechanism. A rope, pulled with sufficient force and proper timing, could strike against the housing and create a single, resonant tone. Not the full peal of a proper bell, but enough to convince a man walking past in the darkness that he had heard something supernatural." Lord Peter straightened, his gaze moving to the small French clock. 7 minutes past 12. A delicate timepiece, easily stopped by a careful hand. And the timing is significant, just after midnight, when our phantom bell tolled. Someone wanted to establish a very precise chronology, Inspector. The question is why? He paused, the faint scent of rosemary and something sharper, more resinous, drifting through the chapel's still air. We are dealing with a mind that appreciates both symbolism and precision. The single bell stroke, the stopped clock, the substituted candle, all elements in a carefully orchestrated performance designed to make murder appear as accident, and accident as supernatural intervention. The afternoon light, filtered through St. Fridswide's colored glass, cast patterns of red and gold across the stone floor where Sir Oswald had met his end. Somewhere in the shadows, Hecate stirred and regarded them with the ancient wisdom of creatures who understand that humans, unlike cats, possess an inexhaustible capacity for self-deception. "Come, Inspector," said Lord Peter, collecting his stick and moving toward the door. "We have established the mechanics of our mystery bell. Now we must discover who possessed both the knowledge to create such an effect and the motive to employ it in service of murder. The afternoon promises to be most illuminating. They took the narrow, spiraling stair within the vestry to its logical conclusion, the bell-cote itself, where the ghost of St. Fridswide's voice had allegedly spoken in the night. Lomas, summoned for his practical knowledge of ladders and his intimate acquaintance with the hall's architectural peculiarities, preceded them up the cramped ascent with the resigned efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years maintaining other people's follies. "Mind the beam there, my lord," he cautioned as Lord Peter's head emerged through the trapdoor into the shallow space beneath the coated gable. "She's got a grudge against hats, that one has." The cavity revealed its secrets with the grudging honesty of old wood and older iron. The oak service beam that had once supported the bell frame remained, its edges darkly polished by decades of weather and neglect. To one side, a rusted iron brace protruded like a broken tooth, and it was here that Lord Peter's attention focused with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly significant manuscript. "Observe, Inspector," he said, extending one long finger to indicate a fresh scrape on the oxidized metal. "Someone has been conducting experiments in practical campanology. And recently." He shifted his position, the better to examine the floor of the bell-cote, where among the accumulated detritus of years, dead wasps, dust, and bird droppings, glittered several amber granules that were decidedly not indigenous to the habitat. "Rosine," he announced with satisfaction, coaxing one of the crystalline fragments into better light. "Colophony, to employ the technical term, the sort that violinists treasure and sailors curse, applied to the hands to prevent slipping when handling rope under conditions requiring precision." He indicated the bell rope hanging below them, its hemp surface worn smooth by decades of disuse. A sharp pull upon this rope, properly timed and executed, would draw it against that iron brace with sufficient force to produce a single, resonant tone. Not the full peal of a proper bell, but enough to convince anyone within earshot that St. Fridswide had found her voice again. Sir Oswald's academic pursuits. Returning to ground level, they made their way to Sir Oswald's study, where the afternoon light revealed the full extent of the deceased baronet's scholarly obsessions. The room was a monument to the collecting instinct run riot. Every surface groaned under the weight of ecclesiastical artifacts, medieval manuscripts, and volumes on subjects ranging from campanology to the more esoteric branches of theological archaeology. "Most illuminating," murmured Lord Peter, extracting a leather-bound volume from a shelf devoted entirely to works on sacred acoustics. "The Phenomenon of Phantom Bells," by the Reverend Dr. Whitmore. Published in 1847, when the Church still entertained the possibility that the Almighty might occasionally employ theatrical effects. The book fell open to a heavily annotated chapter, Sir Oswald's precise handwriting filling the margins with observations and calculations. "Listen to this, Inspector. The creation of bell-like tones without the presence of an actual bell has been observed in numerous ecclesiastical settings. The phenomenon requires only a suspended rope, a resonant housing, and sufficient force to create percussion against metal or stone." Merriman peered over his shoulder at the annotations. "So, Sir Oswald knew the theory?" "More than the theory, I suspect." Lord Peter turned several pages, revealing detailed drawings of clapper mechanisms and acoustic calculations. Here, a marginal note. H.R. quite convinced by demonstration. Effect most satisfactory for intended purpose. H.R., one assumes, being his nephew Hugh, whose recent education in ecclesiastical architecture suddenly acquires new significance. Among the papers scattered across Sir Oswald's desk, they discovered correspondence with his solicitors regarding a new will, one that would disinherit Hugh Rattray in favor of a trust for the furtherance of ecclesiastical music and the preservation of sacred artifacts. Tucked beneath these legal documents was a small, velvet-bound diary its pages filled with Sir Oswald's increasingly bitter observations about his household. The shifting sands of inheritance, Whimsy observed, scanning the diary's entries. Always fertile ground for murder, but see here, Sir Oswald's growing fascination with our parish organist, Mr. Nathaniel Colby, truly understands the soul of sacred music. We have been collaborating on the reconstruction of the original saint, Friedeswide's acoustics, attempting to recreate the precise resonant qualities that made the ancient chapel so remarkable. The organist's dangerous enthusiasm. The diary's later entries revealed a darker turn in Sir Oswald's relationship with Colby. The man's fanaticism grows troubling, one entry read. He speaks not merely of replicating sounds, but of awakening something older. He believes the proper acoustic resonance can achieve actual spiritual manifestation, can call forth the essence of departed saints. His obsession with the bell coat has become almost mystical in its intensity. And here, Lord Peter continued, the final falling out. I have threatened to withdraw my patronage. Colby's research has veered from scholarship into dangerous territory. He grows angry when questioned, speaks of his life's work as if it were a sacred mission rather than mere academic inquiry. They found Colby himself in the parish church, coaxing reluctant harmonies from the ancient organ with the desperate intensity of a man attempting to impose order upon chaos. His pale, ascetic features bore the marks of a sleepless night, and his hands, those sensitive musician's hands, trembled slightly as they moved across the keys. "Lord Peter," he said without turning from his instrument, "I suppose you've come about the bell. The one that couldn't have rung, yet did. A fascinating acoustic phenomenon, don't you think?" "Indeed," said Whimsy pleasantly. "Particularly fascinating when one understands the mechanics involved. You left the hall at 11 last evening, I believe." "Shortly after. Sir Oswald and I had a disagreement about the direction of our research. He had grown timid, unwilling to pursue the full implications of what we had discovered." Colby's voice carried the bitter disappointment of the true fanatic confronted by practical limitations. "And these implications were the power of sound to transcend mere physics, my lord. The ancient monks understood what we have forgotten, that properly tuned resonance can achieve effects that modern science dismisses as impossible. Sir Oswald had been a willing collaborator until he grew frightened of the results." Lord Peter examined his fingernails with elaborate care. "Frightened enough to threaten withdrawal of his patronage?" Colby's hands crashed down upon the keys in a discord that made the ancient stones seem to wince. He called it madness. Said I had confused scholarship with superstition, but he had heard the effects himself, had witnessed what could be achieved with the proper understanding of acoustic principles, including, perhaps, the creation of phantom bells. The organist's face flushed with sudden animation. "You understand?" "Yes, we had successfully recreated the resonant conditions that once made Saint. Fritzwide's bell audible for miles around. A single, perfect tone that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. Sir Oswald was amazed at first, then frightened. He said it was unnatural." The web of motives. As the afternoon wore on, the full complexity of the household's tensions became apparent. Hugh Rattray, faced with disinheritance, had indeed been studying his uncle's research, but whether to understand or to exploit it remained unclear. Miss Lark and young Carse, their romance threatened by Sir Oswald's interference, had been meeting secretly in the garden. Lady Honoria, her comfortable existence dependent upon her brother-in-law's goodwill, watched nervously as family relationships deteriorated. "We have," Lord Peter observed to Merriman as they walked back toward the hall, "a household where everyone possessed both motive and opportunity. The question is not who wished Sir Oswald dead. They all did in their various ways. The question is who possessed the knowledge and skill to arrange such an elaborate charade." The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the chapel, where Hecate maintained her vigil upon the warm cushion that had so intrigued Lord Peter hours earlier. The cat's presence there suddenly acquired new significance. She had chosen the spot not for its comfort, but because someone had recently occupied it. Someone who had waited in the darkness for precisely the right moment to implement a carefully rehearsed plan. The phantom bell, the stopped clock, the substituted candle, Whimsy mused, all elements in a performance designed to transform murder into apparent accident, accident into supernatural intervention. But our composer made one crucial error. He understood the mechanics of deception without fully grasping the psychology of guilt. He paused at the chapel door, his gaze moving from the colored windows to the bell-cote above, where the iron brace still bore its fresh scrape marks. "Come, Inspector. I believe it's time we arranged a small demonstration. Nothing clarifies the mind quite like a practical experiment in the physics of murder." The scent of approaching rain mingled with the ever-present rosemary, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, the first drops began to fall upon stones that had witnessed centuries of human folly, each generation convinced that its particular sins were unique in their complexity and consequence. The rain had begun in earnest as they returned to the chapel, transforming the autumn evening into something appropriately theatrical for Lord Peter's proposed demonstration. He moved with the methodical precision of a stage manager mounting a particularly complex production, positioning Lomas at the garden gate where he had stood the previous night, while Merriman took up residence near the vestry door. "Now then," said Whimsy, ascending the narrow stair to the bell-cote with a length of hemp rope and what appeared to be a small brass weight. "When I give the word, Inspector, note carefully both the sound and its apparent direction. The human ear, like the human conscience, can be remarkably susceptible to suggestion." He emerged through the trap door into the shallow space beneath the coated gable, where the ghost of Saint Fradeswide's voice had allegedly spoken in the night. The oak service beam that had once supported the bell frame remained, its edges darkly polished by decades of weather and neglect. The rusted iron brace protruded like a broken tooth, and it was here that his morning's observation proved most significant. Fresh scrape marks on the oxidized metal, and among the accumulated detritus, several amber granules that glittered in the failing light. "Rosin," he announced with satisfaction, coaxing one of the crystalline fragments into better view. "Colophony, to employ the technical term, applied to the hands to prevent slipping when handling rope under conditions requiring precision. The acoustic revelation, the single, resonant tone that emerged when he pulled the rope against the iron brace carried across the still air with an authority that made even the skeptical Merriman start involuntarily. It possessed that particular quality of ancient bronze, deep, mournful, and somehow accusatory, that had convinced Lomas he was hearing the voice of a bell that had been silent for 30 years. "Remarkable," Whimsy observed, descending to rejoin the inspector. "A simple matter of applied physics, yet the effect is genuinely unsettling. One understands how the medieval mind might have attributed such phenomena to supernatural intervention. But observe this timing, Inspector." He moved to the French clock in the vestry, wound it just enough to tick with prim delicacy, then lifted the glass and demonstrated how a thin sliver of card could arrest the mechanism at any desired moment. 7 minutes past 12, the precise moment our phantom bell tolled. A careful finger stops a careless witness, and it is surprising how often an alibi rests upon such courtesies to horology. "Time me," he said cheerfully, and proceeded to demonstrate the route from bell-cote to vestry to chapel and back, completing the circuit in under 3 minutes. Allow 30 seconds for breathing and the recovery of one's soul. 3 minutes suffices for a man who knows his way about the house's conveniences. The chemical investigation. But it was not merely the mechanical success that had captured Whimsy's attention. As they examined the evidence more closely, the substituted paraffin candle revealed its secrets under careful scrutiny. He lit both beeswax and paraffin tapers, demonstrating how the draft from the unlatched window affected each differently. Beeswax composes itself with dignity under provocation, he observed. Paraffin loses its temper and weeps. The mark on Sir Oswald's cheek will match the texture of paraffin, not beeswax. Someone chose paraffin because someone wanted tears, visible evidence of a toppled light. The scent that had haunted the corridors proved equally revealing upon closer investigation. It was not merely rosemary, but rosemary combined with something more complex, a resinous quality that spoke of frankincense and older traditions than comfortable Anglicanism typically encompassed. Our bell ringer was not content with simple acoustics, Whimsy murmured, examining the residue on the bell rope with the absorption of a naturalist studying an unusual specimen. He employed additional refinements that suggest knowledge of rather more esoteric traditions than campanology typically encompasses. The academic connection. Their subsequent investigation into Colby's background revealed layers of complexity that transformed the humble parish organist into something far more intriguing. A discreet inquiry at the village inn, where gossip flowed as freely as ale, disclosed that the organist's lodgings above the baker's shop contained an unusual collection of books and apparatus. Most illuminating, Lord Peter observed, when a carefully worded conversation with the baker's wife revealed Colby's nocturnal activities. Chemical experiments, she says, with strange smells and colored flames. All in service of his research into sacred music, naturally. One begins to suspect that Mr. Colby's interests extend rather beyond the conventional organist's repertoire. Further inquiry at the county library revealed that Nathaniel Colby was not merely a parish musician, but Dr. Nathaniel Colby, formerly of King's College, Cambridge, whose fellowship had been terminated 10 years earlier for research into subjects incompatible with Christian doctrine. His published papers on acoustic manifestation of spiritual presences had created sufficient scandal to ensure his exile from academic circles. The household tensions. Meanwhile, the various members of the household continued to reveal their individual anxieties and secrets. Hugh Rattray, confronted with evidence of his uncle's planned disinheritance, grew increasingly desperate and incoherent. Miss Lark and young Cass, their romance threatened by Sir Oswald's interference, maintained their story of midnight garden walks with the stubborn consistency of lovers protecting their shared secret. Lady Honoria, her comfortable existence dependent upon family goodwill, watched the proceedings with the calculating attention of someone whose survival had always depended upon reading the social weather correctly. Even Pritchard, the grotesque butler, seemed to shrink further into his professional invisibility, as if hoping that sufficient deference might render him transparent to investigation. The evidence accumulates. As the evening progressed, the accumulated evidence began to form a pattern that was both complex and elegantly simple. The warm cushion where Hecate had chosen to sleep, the substituted candle, the unlatched window, the stopped clock, the phantom bell, all elements in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated performance designed to transform murder into apparent accident. We are dealing with a mind that appreciates both symbolism and precision, Whimsy observed to Merriman as they prepared for the evening's final act. The single bell stroke, the stopped clock, the substituted candle, all elements in a performance designed to make murder appear as accident and accident as supernatural intervention. But questions remained. The silver salver, missing from its usual place in the vestry and discovered in the east corridor, suggested hasty improvisation. The particular combination of scents, rosemary and frankincense and something sharper, spoke of preparations more elaborate than simple murder required. The gathering storm. As midnight approached, Lord Peter made his final preparations with the methodical attention of a conductor preparing for a particularly challenging symphony. The household would be assembled, the stage set, and the mystery resolved through practical demonstration rather than mere theoretical exposition. "Inspector," he said, collecting his stick and moving toward the door, "I believe it's time we arranged our little gathering." Nothing clarifies the mind quite like a practical experiment in the physics of murder, particularly when conducted before an audience that includes the murderer himself. The scent of rain and rosemary drifted through the corridors, carrying with it the promise of revelation and the bitter satisfaction of justice served. In the chapel, Hecate maintained her vigil upon the warm cushion, a silent witness to human folly and the inexorable working of consequence upon crime. The midnight hour was approaching, and with it the final act of a drama that had begun with a phantom bell and would end with the unmasking of a mind clever enough to orchestrate supernatural intervention, yet foolish enough to believe that murder could be disguised as miracle. The midnight hour approached with the inexorable quality of judgment itself, and Lord Peter's promised demonstration took shape with the methodical precision of a conductor arranging his final symphony. The household gathered in the chapel under circumstances that transformed the sacred space into something resembling a court of inquiry, each member positioned with careful attention to both their claimed whereabouts and their psychological vulnerabilities. Lady Honoria arrived supported by Pritchard's grotesque solicitude, her vinaigrette clutched like a talisman against the evening's revelations. Miss Locke entered with the rigid composure of someone who had spent the intervening hours rehearsing innocence, while young Carse hovered nearby with the protective anxiety of a terrier guarding wounded prey. Hugh Rattray positioned himself near the vestry door with the strategic awareness of a man calculating distances to various exits, his bloodshot eyes betraying the afternoon's communion with his uncle's whiskey. Dr. Colby arrived last, his pale features animated by that peculiar intensity which makes saints and fanatics indistinguishable by candlelight. He moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that every gesture would be observed and catalogued, yet could not entirely suppress the scholar's fascination with witnessing his own work subjected to expert analysis. The stage set for truth. Lord Peter had arranged the chapel with theatrical attention to detail. The south window stood deliberately unlatched, admitting the night's chill breath that set the candle flames dancing like nervous spirits. Upon the altar, 2 tapers waited side by side, one of honest beeswax, the other of common paraffin, like opposing doctrines prepared for theological debate. The French clock in the vestry ticked with prim regularity, its glass lifted to reveal the delicate mechanism that had been made to serve deception's purposes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whimsy began, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused detachment he reserved for the more baroque manifestations of human wickedness, "we gather to witness a demonstration in practical theology, specifically how the miraculous may be manufactured by those with sufficient knowledge and motivation." He moved to the altar, where Hecate maintained her vigil upon the warm cushion that had first caught his attention. The cat's presence there suddenly acquired new significance. She had chosen the spot not for its comfort, but because someone had recently occupied it. Someone who had waited in patient darkness for precisely the right moment to implement a carefully rehearsed plan. "Observe," he said, lighting first the beeswax candle, then its paraffin companion. "Mrs. Munn." Bellwether, whose devotion to proper ecclesiastical practice borders on the sublime, placed a beeswax taper here yesterday evening. Yet the wax found upon Sir Oswald's cheek was unmistakably paraffin, a substance that weeps more readily under provocation and leaves distinctly different residue. The acoustic revelation. Without warning, Lord Peter vanished into the vestry and up the narrow stair to the bellcote above. The single, resonant tone that emerged when he demonstrated the rope's percussion against the iron brace carried across the still air with an authority that made even the skeptical Merriman start involuntarily. It possessed that particular quality of ancient bronze, deep, mournful, and somehow accusatory, that had convinced honest Lomas he was hearing supernatural intervention. "Remarkable," Whimsy observed, descending to rejoin his audience. "How simple physics may be transformed into apparent miracle through proper application of acoustic principles. A matter of timing, leverage, and intimate knowledge of the chapel's structural peculiarities." He produced from his waistcoat pocket a small fragment of crystalline amber. "Rosine, discovered in the bellcote among the accumulated detritus of years. Applied to the hands to prevent slipping when handling rope under conditions requiring precision. Not a substance one would expect to find in a chapel, unless someone had been conducting experiments in practical campanology. The physical evidence speaks." From the vestry, he retrieved the silver salver that had been discovered in the east corridor, its polished surface bearing the telltale signs of recent abuse. Scorches marked its face, and along the edge clung a dusting of hardened grains, some pale and translucent, others darker as if charred. Mrs. Bellwether's outrage at finding her plate transformed into an improvised thurible was entirely justified, he observed. Someone required a censer for their devotions and found domestic silver more readily available than proper ecclesiastical equipment. The residue tells its own story. Frankincense burned in haste, leaving traces that no amount of polishing could entirely erase. He moved to the French clock, demonstrating with delicate precision how a thin sliver of card could arrest the mechanism at any desired moment. 7 minutes past 12, the precise moment our phantom bell tolled. A careful finger stops a careless witness, and chronology becomes the servant of alibi rather than truth. The psychological web. As Lord Peter methodically dismantled the evening's careful choreography, the assembled household began to exhibit those small betrayals of expression that guilt produces despite the mind's best efforts at concealment. Hugh Rattray's hands trembled with more than whiskey. Miss Lark's composure cracked like ice in spring, and even Pritchard's professional invisibility seemed to waver under the weight of accumulated tension. "We are dealing with a mind that appreciates both symbolism and precision," Whimsy observed, his gaze moving deliberately from face to face. The single bell stroke, the stopped clock, the substituted candle, all elements in a carefully orchestrated performance designed to make murder appear as accident, and accident as supernatural intervention. Dr. Colby's pale features had grown ashen, but his eyes still blazed with the fanatic's unquenchable conviction. "You speak of murder as if it were mere criminality," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "But what if Sir Oswald's death was itself a manifestation, a judgment rendered by forces beyond our understanding?" "An interesting theological position," Whimsy replied pleasantly, "but one that fails to account for the distinctly temporal evidence of premeditation. Knowledge of household routines, intimate familiarity with the chapel's acoustic properties, and access to the materials necessary for creating theatrical effects." The tightening noose. The room's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken accusations and barely contained hysteria. Each member of the household found themselves caught between their own guilty secrets and the growing realization that someone among them had transformed those secrets into camouflage for murder. "The beauty of this plan," Lord Peter continued, his tone growing almost conversational, "lay in its psychological sophistication. A household full of people with guilty secrets would provide perfect camouflage for one genuinely guilty person. Each suspect would focus on concealing their own minor sins, leaving little attention for the major crime occurring in their midst." He paused at the chapel's center, where the flagstone still bore faint traces of the previous night's tragedy. The assembled company sat in stunned silence as the full implications of his words began to penetrate their consciousness. Even the rain seemed to pause, as if the universe itself were holding its breath for the revelation that would transform suspicion into certainty. "But our composer made one crucial error," Whimsy observed, his voice carrying the inexorable quality of fate itself. He understood the mechanics of deception without fully grasping the psychology of guilt. He could create phantom bells and stopped clocks, but he could not control the human tendency to betray oneself through small, unconscious actions. The midnight hour struck from the distant village church, its honest bronze voice carrying across the rain-soaked countryside like a summons to judgment. In the chapel, Hecate stirred upon her warm cushion and regarded the assembled humans with the ancient wisdom of creatures who understand that justice, like truth, has its own inexorable rhythm. Lord Peter smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever, and prepared to deliver the final movement of a composition that had begun with phantom bells and would end with the unmasking of a mind clever enough to orchestrate supernatural intervention, yet foolish enough to believe that murder could be disguised as miracle. "Shall we proceed?" he said softly. "To the final demonstration. I believe it's time we discovered who among us possesses not merely the knowledge to create such effects, but the particular combination of desperation and arrogance necessary to employ them in service of murder." The silence that followed Lord Peter's question possessed the particular quality of a drawn blade, sharp, dangerous, and pregnant with the promise of blood. Each member of the assembled household sat frozen in attitudes that revealed more than movement could have done, their carefully maintained facades beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated tension and guilty knowledge. The methodical dissection. "Let us proceed systematically," Whimsy announced, his voice carrying that tone of amused detachment he reserved for the more baroque manifestations of human wickedness. "We shall examine the evidence as a surgeon examines a corpse, methodically, without sentiment, and with particular attention to those details that the living would prefer to keep hidden." He moved to the altar where the 2 candles, beeswax and paraffin, continued their silent testimony to substitution and deception. Mrs. Bellwether, whose devotion to proper ecclesiastical practice borders on the sublime, placed a beeswax candle here yesterday evening. Yet the wax found upon Sir Oswald's cheek was unmistakably paraffin, a substance that weeps more readily under provocation and leaves distinctly different residue. From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a small fragment of crystalline amber. Rosin, discovered in the bell coat among the accumulated detritus of years, applied to the hands to prevent slipping when handling rope under conditions requiring precision. Not a substance one would expect to find in a chapel unless someone had been conducting experiments in practical campanology. Dr. Colby's pale features had grown ashen, but his eyes still blazed with the unquenchable conviction of the true fanatic. His hands, those sensitive musician's fingers that had coaxed harmony from reluctant keys, trembled slightly as Lord Peter's gaze fixed upon him with surgical precision. "The acoustic evidence. The phantom bell," Whimsy continued, demonstrating once again how a sharp pull upon the rope could create the illusion of supernatural intervention, required intimate knowledge of the chapel's structural peculiarities. Someone had experimented with these acoustics, perhaps with Sir Oswald himself, learning how to produce that single resonant tone that convinced honest Lomas he was hearing divine intervention. He moved to the French clock in the vestry, its mechanism ticking with prim regularity. 7 minutes past 12, the precise moment our phantom bell tolled. A delicate timepiece easily stopped by a careful hand. "The timing is significant, Doctor Colby. It establishes a chronology that places you returning to your lodgings at 20 past 12, just as Mrs. Hartwell testified, after the bell had tolled, after Sir Oswald had died." The chemical analysis. From the vestry, he retrieved the scorched silver salver with its telltale residue. "Mrs. Bellwether's outrage at finding her plate transformed into an improvised thurible was entirely justified. Someone required a censer for their ritual preparations and found domestic silver more readily available than proper ecclesiastical equipment. The residue tells its own story, frankincense burned in haste, creating that churchy smell that Lomas noticed, designed to enhance the illusion of supernatural intervention. Dr. Colby's composure began to crack visibly, his academic facade crumbling before the relentless accumulation of physical evidence. "You understand nothing," he whispered, his voice carrying the desperate quality of a man watching his life's work exposed as elaborate fraud. Sir Oswald was destroying everything, my research, my discoveries, my life's purpose. The psychological trap. Indeed he was, Whimsy agreed with dangerous mildness. Your collaboration on recreating the acoustic conditions of the original Saint. Fritzwide's had been remarkably successful, but Sir Oswald grew frightened when your research veered from scholarship into what he perceived as dangerous territory. He threatened to withdraw his patronage and expose your methods to ecclesiastical authorities. The organist's careful control finally shattered entirely. He called it madness, said I had confused scholarship with superstition, but he had witnessed the effects himself, had seen what could be achieved with proper understanding of acoustic principles and ritual preparation. The confession. What followed possessed the terrible clarity of a man who had convinced himself that murder was merely another form of scholarly inquiry. Dr. Colby described how he had prepared the chapel with ritual precision, substituting the paraffin candle, unlatching the south window to create proper acoustic conditions, stopping the French clock at the precise moment that would serve his elaborate alibi. "Sir Oswald was waiting when I arrived at midnight," he said, his voice growing distant as if recounting events from some half-remembered academic exercise. "He had discovered my true purpose. Not merely to recreate ancient sounds, but to achieve actual communion with spiritual forces through proper acoustic resonance. He called me a charlatan who had perverted sacred knowledge for personal gain." The physical confrontation had been brief but decisive. Sir Oswald, despite his age and bulk, had attempted to prevent what he saw as a desecration of sacred space. In the struggle, the older man had fallen, striking his head upon the altar step with fatal finality. "But you couldn't simply leave him there," Whimsy observed with the detached interest of a scholar examining a particularly complex manuscript. The scene required proper staging to transform accident into apparent divine intervention. You lit the frankincense, creating the otherworldly atmosphere that would convince witnesses they had experienced something supernatural. You tolled the phantom bell to announce the moment of judgment, then arranged the evidence to suggest that Sir Oswald had died during solitary devotions. The final resolution. Dr. Colby nodded slowly, his confession complete, but his conviction unshaken. "He died as he lived," he said with bitter satisfaction, refusing to acknowledge forces greater than his own limited understanding. The bell tolled for him as it had tolled for countless souls before, a summons to judgment that transcends human law. Inspector Merriman stepped forward with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had witnessed too many such revelations to find them shocking. The handcuffs clicked with the finality of justice served, and Dr. Nathaniel Colby, formerly of King's College, Cambridge, was led away into the rain-soaked darkness that had concealed his crimes, but could not ultimately protect him from their consequences. Epilogue. The chapel fell silent, except for the soft patter of rain against ancient stones and the gentle purring of Hecate, who had observed the entire proceedings with the serene detachment of a creature who understood that human justice, like human folly, followed patterns as predictable as the changing seasons. Lord Peter collected his stick and moved toward the door, pausing to regard the empty bell-cote with that expression of amused melancholy he reserved for the more instructive failures of human nature. "Come, Inspector," he said softly. "We have established that the supernatural was merely personal taste, that bells may speak when pulled by guilty hands, and that murder, however elaborately disguised, remains the most mundane of human failings. The saints will sleep more peacefully now, and Hecate may choose her cushions without regard for the temperature of guilty consciences. The scent of rosemary and rain drifted through the corridors as they departed, carrying with it the promise that justice, like truth, possesses its own inexorable rhythm, patient, methodical, and ultimately as unavoidable as the tolling of an honest bell. The silence that followed Dr. Colby's departure possessed the particular quality of air after thunder, charged with the memory of violence, yet somehow cleaner for its passing. The household dispersed with the cautious movements of people who had witnessed surgery performed upon their own assumptions, each retreating to familiar corners where the comfortable illusions of daily life might be reassembled with proper English discretion. Lady Honoria departed on Pritchard's grotesque arm, her vinaigrette clutched like a talisman against the evening's unwelcome revelations. Her pale features bore the stunned expression of someone who had discovered that her carefully maintained world contained depths she had never suspected and had no desire to explore further. Miss Lark and young Cass vanished into the garden shadows with the peculiar relief of lovers who had suddenly discovered their minor sins, transformed into blessed innocence by proximity to genuine crime. Hugh Rattray lingered in the doorway, his bloodshot eyes fixed upon Lord Peter with an expression that mingled gratitude and something approaching awe. The revelation of his uncle's murder had paradoxically lifted the crushing weight of anticipated disinheritance. Sir Oswald's death occurring before the new will could be executed meant that Hugh would inherit after all, though the circumstances made the inheritance feel more like a burden than a blessing. The final evidence. Lord Peter, however, was not quite finished with his investigation. With the methodical attention of a scholar completing a particularly complex manuscript, he conducted one final examination of the chapel's remaining secrets. The warm cushion where Hecate had chosen to sleep still bore the faint impression of recent occupancy, and upon closer inspection revealed traces that spoke to the morning's activities. "Observe, Inspector," he said, coaxing a few damp fibers from the velvet nap. "Someone sat here after the rain began, after 2 o'clock when the weather turned. The fabric retains the impression of a wet wool coat, suggesting that our visitor had been outdoors in the morning shower. Mrs. Bellwether, summoned for her encyclopedic knowledge of household movements, confirmed that she had found her precious silver salver in the east corridor at 6:15, still warm to the touch and reeking of burned frankincense. Like a baby's bath, she declared with characteristic precision, which is to say, not boiling, but not far off. The salver itself told its own story under careful examination. Scorch marks decorated its polished surface, and along the edges clung hardened grains of resin, some pale and translucent, others darker as if charred. Someone had indeed used Mrs. Bellwether's domestic silver as an improvised, thurible, burning incense to create the otherworldly atmosphere that would convince witnesses they had experienced supernatural intervention. Dr. Colby's ritual preparations, Whimsy observed, extended beyond mere acoustics. He understood that murder, like theatre, succeeds through the careful orchestration of multiple sensory impressions. The phantom bell provided auditory evidence of divine intervention, while the frankincense supplied the olfactory confirmation of sacred presence. The psychological resolution. As the evening progressed, the full psychological impact of the revelation began to settle upon the household like sediment in still water. Each member processed the truth according to their own particular vulnerabilities and strengths. Hugh Rattray, faced with the sobering prospect of actually managing the estate without his uncle's iron guidance, retreated to the library where he sat staring at account books with the bewildered expression of a man who had inherited more responsibility than he had ever desired. Miss Lark and young Cass, their romance no longer threatened by baronial interference, discovered that love, freed from the necessity of secrecy, required new forms of expression. They walked in the garden with the careful courtesy of people learning to be happy without the familiar stimulus of opposition. Even Pritchard, the grotesque butler, seemed somehow diminished by the evening's revelations. His professional invisibility, cultivated over decades of faithful service, had proved inadequate protection against the harsh light of criminal investigation. He moved through his duties with the mechanical precision of a man whose universe had been fundamentally altered, yet who lacked the vocabulary to express the change. The intellectual aftermath. The truly disturbing aspect, Lord Peter observed to Inspector Merriman as they prepared to depart, is not that Dr. Colby committed murder, but that he convinced himself it was something nobler. When genuine scholarship becomes the servant of personal obsession, the results are invariably more dangerous than simple ignorance. The distinction possessed a terrible clarity that made even the practical Merriman shiver despite the evening's relative warmth. They had encountered not mere criminality, but the far more dangerous phenomenon of intellectual fanaticism, the corruption of legitimate learning by pride and desperation, until murder became merely another form of research methodology. Dr. Colby's fate would be decided by judge and jury, but his real tragedy lay in the transformation of a brilliant mind into an instrument of self-justification. His knowledge of acoustics, his understanding of ritual symbolism, his appreciation for the psychological impact of carefully orchestrated effects, all had been perverted in service of a delusion that elevated personal vengeance to the level of divine judgment. The final departure. As Lord Peter collected his stick and prepared to leave Graythorpe Hall to its uncertain future, he paused for one last look at the chapel where the night's drama had unfolded. Hecate maintained her vigil upon the warm cushion, a silent witness to human folly and the eternal struggle between truth and self-deception. "You know, Inspector," he said, lighting a cigarette with the deliberate care of a man who understood that small rituals often provide necessary anchors in a universe grown suddenly unstable. "The most remarkable aspect of this entire affair is how perfectly it illustrates the fundamental difference between mystery and mystification. True mystery, the kind that saints and philosophers contemplate, requires humility before the unknown. Mystification, on the other hand, is merely the manipulation of ignorance for personal advantage." The rain had ceased, leaving the autumn air clean and sharp with the scent of wet stone and dying leaves. As they drove through the countryside toward more comfortable accommodations, the lights of Graythorpe Hall dwindled behind them like a stage set after the final curtain. Its mysteries resolved, but its lessons perhaps not entirely learned. In the chapel, the saints in their colored glass windows resumed their patient observation of human folly, secure in the knowledge that time, like justice, possessed its own inexorable rhythm, patient, methodical, and ultimately as unavoidable as the tolling of an honest bell. The phantom voice of St. Fridwide had been silenced, but the genuine mysteries of existence continued their ancient dialogue with those wise enough to listen without presuming to manipulate the conversation. The case of the cat who slept in the chapel was closed, but the eternal questions it had raised about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between faith and fanaticism, would echo long after the last evidence had been filed away and the last witness had returned to the comfortable illusions of ordinary life. The morning after, Doctor. Colby's arrest dawned with that particular clarity that follows the resolution of long-standing mysteries, as if the very air had been purged of accumulated deceptions. Lord Peter found himself lingering over breakfast at the village inn, reluctant to abandon entirely a case that had revealed such fascinating depths of human self-deception. Inspector Merriman joined him with a manila folder and the satisfied air of a man who had witnessed justice served with appropriate theatrical flourishes. "Dr. Clavering's post-mortem confirms everything," Merriman announced, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that protested with creaking resignation. "Subdural hemorrhage due to fall, time consistent with shortly after midnight. No prior stroke, no poison." He paused, consulting his notes with the thoroughness of a man who understood that details matter. And the wax on the cheek. Definitely paraffin, as you said. Cats and coroners do not argue, said Whimsy, buttering his toast with the precision of a man who understood that small rituals provide necessary anchors in an unstable universe. One purrs, the other pronounces. Both possess that invaluable gift of seeing things as they are, rather than as we wish them to be. The final evidence resolved. The glove business still puzzles me, Merriman admitted, producing his notebook with the persistence of a man determined to understand every detail. Elementary chemistry, Lord Peter replied pleasantly. The right hand hauled the rope. Rosin is a vulgar friend that clings like gratitude and marks like sin. Dr. Colby kept the right glove to grip the hemp and avoid betraying his chemistry. The left remained bare for finesse, stopping the clock, lighting matches, the delicate placement of card and wick. You notice the smear on the left cuff. Frankincense is democratic in its attachments. And the rug in the vestry, turned back to obscure an incriminating shoe mark in Mrs. Bellwether's pristine dust. Her corners are articles of faith. An apostate had meddled, and one does not argue theology with a housekeeper of her convictions. Lord Peter drew from his waistcoat pocket the minute grain he had retrieved from Hecate's velvet throne, laying it on the saucer where it caught the morning light with faint, illicit sparkle. Twin to the rosin in the bell coat. Our scholar waited on that cushion for the moment of his miracle. The cat, being theologically orthodox, recognized residual warmth as the only reliable doctrine. The household's aftermath. The psychological impact upon Graythorpe Hall's inhabitants proved as revealing as the physical evidence. Hugh Rattray, faced with inheriting an estate he had never expected to manage, discovered reserves of character that surprised everyone, including himself. The revelation that his uncle's death had occurred before the new will could be executed meant inheritance preserved, though the circumstances made the legacy feel more burden than blessing. Miss Locke and young Cass, their romance no longer threatened by baronial interference, were already making modest plans for a spring wedding. Lady Honoria had retreated to her novels with renewed appreciation for fictional crimes over their real counterparts. Even Pritchard had recovered his professional equilibrium, though he moved through his duties with the careful attention of a man who had learned that domestic tranquility could shatter without warning. Dr. Colby himself, according to Merriman's reports, remained unrepentant in custody. Still maintains he was conducting legitimate research into spiritual manifestation through acoustic resonance, the inspector reported with professional disgust. Quite proud of his achievement, as he calls it. Says Sir Oswald's death was merely the inevitable consequence of opposing genuine scholarship. The intellectual crime. The final refuge of the intellectual criminal, Whimsy observed, his tone carrying that particular quality of amused detachment he reserved for the more baroque manifestations of human self-deception. When ordinary motives prove insufficient, one elevates crime to the level of scholarly inquiry. It's remarkable how easily murder becomes methodology when filtered through sufficient academic pretension. The confession, examined in detail, revealed the full extent of Dr. Colby's elaborate preparations, weeks of studying household routines, experimenting with acoustic properties, perfecting his phantom bell technique. The frankincense had been procured from London ecclesiastical suppliers, the rosin from his own violin case. Every detail spoke to the thoroughness of a mind that had confused scholarship with vengeance. What strikes me as most disturbing, Lord Peter continued, is the sheer intellectual arrogance required to transform personal vendetta into cosmic justice. Dr. Colby genuinely believed he was serving higher purposes, that Sir Oswald's opposition to his research justified not merely murder, but murder disguised as divine intervention. The philosophical resolution. As they prepared to depart the village, leaving Graythorpe Hall to its uncertain but hopeful future, Lord Peter paused for one final observation. The chapel, visible through the inn's windows, seemed somehow smaller in daylight, its mysteries resolved, its phantom voices silenced. "You know, Inspector," he said, collecting his stick and settling his account, "the truly remarkable aspect is how perfectly this case illustrates the fundamental difference between genuine mystery and mere mystification. True mystery, the kind that saints and philosophers contemplate, requires humility before the unknown. Mystification is merely the manipulation of ignorance for personal advantage." The vicar had called early, pale and fluttered, to express gratitude that Providence had worked through secular channels with such admirable efficiency. "I shall preach Sunday on 'Try the spirits whether they are of God,'" he had murmured, though perhaps without the more alarming practical applications. "Admirable," Whimsy had replied. "Only do not omit the verb. The epistle dislikes ellipses as much as I do." As their car wound through the countryside, Graythorpe Hall dwindled behind them like a stage set after the final curtain. The case of the phantom bell was closed, but its lessons would echo long after the last evidence was filed away, a reminder that human nature, like the tolling of an honest bell, follows patterns as predictable as they are eternally fascinating to those with patience to listen and wisdom to understand. "At least," said Whimsy, half to himself and half to the autumn sky, "we have corrected one misquotation. It is not bells that toll for thee, but men. And men, unlike bells, require very little encouragement to ring for themselves." The saints in their colored windows would resume their patient observation of human folly, secure in the knowledge that time, like justice, possessed its own inexorable rhythm, patient, methodical, and ultimately as unavoidable as truth itself. The journey back to London provided that particular species of contemplative silence that follows the resolution of complex mysteries when the mind processes revelations with the methodical attention of a scholar filing away hard-won knowledge. Lord Peter watched. The countryside rolled past with the detached interest of a man who had witnessed human nature reveal itself in all its baroque complexity, yet remained perpetually surprised by the ingenuity with which people justified their worst impulses. Inspector Merriman broke the comfortable quiet as their motor car approached the outskirts of the metropolis. "One thing still bothers me about the whole business," he said, consulting his notebook with the persistence of a man determined to understand every nuance. "Why go to such elaborate lengths? A simple push down the chapel steps would have served just as well, and with considerably less risk of discovery." "Ah, but you mistake the psychology of our academic murderer," Whimsy replied, lighting a cigarette with the deliberate care of a man who understood that small rituals often provide necessary anchors in a suddenly unstable universe. Dr. Colby could not simply commit murder. He had to commit significant murder. The elaborate staging was not camouflage, but validation, proof that his actions transcended mere criminality and achieved the level of cosmic justice. The final evidence. London received him with its accustomed indifference, the streets going about their business with that brisk, impersonal efficiency which is the nearest thing to kindness a great city offers. Over coffee in his club, with the fire making a gentlemanly pretense of warmth, Lord Peter opened Merriman's letter and found in it the comfortable prose of a man whose paperwork had at last overtaken his policemanship. Dr. Clavering's report was conclusive. The laboratory had matched the rosingrains from the bel cote to a cake found in Colby's violin case. The residue on Mrs. Bellwether's salver proved to be frankincense adulterated with labdanum, a resin which, when heated, lent the incense that wild, herbaceous tang that had haunted the corridors. The paraffin, the clock, the rope, each item, like a well-drilled witness, now said the same thing in different words. Colby, remanded without bail, had made a further statement in which penitents wrestled pugnaciously with pride and lost. The hidden testament. A second envelope, large and clumsily sealed, bore Graythorpe's crest and Hugh Rattray's ill-disciplined hand. Inside lay a short note and a folded paper browned by the pressure of years between Bible leaves. "Found in Uncle's study Bible at Romans 6, Hugh had scrawled. "Pressed into the gutter where the page falls open of itself." He must have meant to sign and send it. There's the draft of a memorandum to the solicitors, and Miss Locke's name with an annuity of 500 and permission to marry where she pleases. "I thought you ought to know. It alters nothing legal, I'm told, but it alters something all the same." Lord Peter read the cramped lines in Sir Oswald's impatient hand, a grudging concession, tart even in kindness, and laid it down with that particular weariness which overtakes one at the moment when all the cleverness is done and the stupidity remains. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. Sir Oswald had been preparing to grant the very concessions that his murder was designed to prevent, his change of heart arriving too late to save either his life or his murderer's soul. The academic mind corrupted. The confession, examined in its entirety during the morning's proceedings, had revealed the full extent of Dr. Colby's intellectual arrogance. He had spent weeks perfecting his phantom bell technique, not merely to create an alibi, but to demonstrate his mastery over the very forces that Sir Oswald had dismissed as superstitious nonsense. The frankincense, the stopped clock, the substituted candle, all elements in what he genuinely believed was a scholarly demonstration of supernatural intervention. "Consider the sheer audacity of it," Lord Peter had observed to Merriman during their journey. He murdered Sir Oswald, not simply to preserve his research funding, but to prove the validity of his theories through practical application. In his twisted logic, the success of his deception would vindicate his entire academic career. Madness, Inspector, is merely a convenient label for those deviations from the norm that we find too unsettling to comprehend. Colby was not mad. He was merely possessed of an over-ardent conviction in his own intellectual superiority. The household's resolution. Word had reached them that the household at Graythorpe Hall was already adapting to its altered circumstances with that peculiar resilience that characterizes the English response to domestic catastrophe. Hugh Rattray, faced with inheriting responsibilities he had never expected to assume, was discovering reserves of character that surprised everyone, including himself. Miss Locke and young Cass, their romance no longer threatened by baronial interference, had already begun making modest plans for a spring wedding, the revelation of Sir Oswald's intended generosity adding poignancy to their happiness. Lady Honoria had retreated to her novels with renewed appreciation for fictional crimes over their real counterparts. Even Pritchard had recovered his professional equilibrium, though he moved through his duties with the careful attention of a man who had learned that domestic tranquility could shatter without warning. Literary corrections and philosophical musings. "Bunter," Lord Peter said, when the discreet apparition materialized with fresh coffee, "make a memorandum that human beings will invariably put off their virtues till after dinner, and sometimes too long after." "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, accepting the anthropology without surprise. Over luncheon, an argumentative acquaintance misquoted Don with cheerful certainty. "No man is an island, eh? Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." "No," said Lord Peter amiably. "Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." The verb is perfectly adequate, if allowed to perform its office. The final reflection. Later, walking past St. James's, where an honest bell tolled the hour in decent workaday bronze, he thought how very little machinery innocence requires. Colby, in his zeal, had served not God, but an idol hammered by his own hands and named science to make the worship respectable. Sir Oswald had served himself and called it duty. Between them, they had very nearly sacrificed a girl's future upon an altar improvised out of silver plate. The case of the cat who slept in the chapel was officially closed, but its lessons would echo long after the last evidence was filed away. Hecate, at least, would have chosen the warmest cushion without argument, understanding the fundamental truth that warmth is more reliable than divine intervention. A sound, practical theologian, that cat. One could do worse than follow her example. Outside, London's traffic made its continuous antiphon, decent as a litany. Somewhere a bell struck the quarter, honest metal, honest air, no superstition, no mystification. He smiled a little, the smile with no warmth in it, and thought that Saint Frideswide, having heard enough of human cleverness, would be glad of the silence. The phantom voice had been silenced, but the genuine mysteries of existence continued their ancient dialogue with those wise enough to listen, without presuming to manipulate the conversation. In the end, justice had been served with appropriate attention to both theatrical effect and practical necessity, leaving behind only the comfortable certainty that truth, however elaborately disguised, possessed its own inexorable rhythm, patient, methodical, and ultimately as unavoidable as the morning light that had finally dispelled the shadows of Graythorpe Hall. 3 months later, the Morning Post brought correspondence that transformed the Graythorpe affair from active investigation to satisfied memory. Hugh Rattray's letter, written with newfound confidence, announced Miss Locke's marriage to young Carse and his own engagement to the vicar's sensible daughter. "The chapel has been properly consecrated," he wrote, "with an honest bell cast by the same foundry that made the original saint. Frideswide's. It rings only at canonical hours and sounds, the villagers say, like forgiveness." Lady Honoria's accompanying parcel contained the French clock wrapped in lavender-scented linen. "It has always made me nervous," she explained, "and I am persuaded it would be happier elsewhere." Lord Peter set it upon his mantel-shelf, lifted the glass with surgical precision, and extracted from the escapement a thin wafer of card, the same that had stopped time in service of murder. He flicked it into the fire and watched it curl like a confession meeting flame. Dr. Colby, according to Merriman's final report, remained unrepentant in Pentonville, his brilliant mind now devoted to theological treatises that would never see publication. The prison chaplain noted that he continued to justify his actions as legitimate research, though recent theological debates with fellow inmates had left him with a broken nose and renewed appreciation for the difference between theory and practice. "You know, Bunter," Lord Peter observed, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had witnessed justice served with appropriate theatrical flourishes, "the most remarkable aspect of this entire affair was not the elaborate deception, but the fundamental simplicity beneath it all. Colby possessed genuine scholarship, yet he corrupted it in service of the most mundane of motives, wounded pride and threatened livelihood." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied, arranging the morning papers with mathematical precision, "though I believe the cat deserves considerable credit for her practical theology. She understood from the beginning that warmth was more reliable than supernatural intervention." Outside, London's traffic made its continuous antiphon, decent as a litany. Somewhere St. James's bell struck the hour in honest bronze. No mystification, no phantom echoes, simply metal speaking truth to air. A small black cat materialized from the November dusk and inspected Lord Peter through the window with judicial approval, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood that the most profound truths require no artifice. "Quite right," he murmured, lifting his hat to both the cat and Don's ghost. "Bells for men, cushions for cats, beeswax for saints, and truth for those who can endure it without embellishment." The case of the cat who slept in the chapel was closed, but its lessons would endure, a reminder that human nature, like the tolling of an honest bell, follows patterns as predictable as they are eternally fascinating to those with patience to observe and wisdom to understand. In the end, justice had been served, domestic happiness restored, and the phantom voices silenced by the simple expedient of allowing truth to speak for itself. At Graythorpe Hall, Hecate slept peacefully upon her cushion, and all was well.